From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston, and we start today with the markets. Maybe we have a fourth day in a row, and Kaylee Lyons is going to tell us about it. So, Kaylee, how are we doing?
Yeah, we are heading for our fourth day of gains, David. It's so interesting because looking at the equity market, you wouldn't really know that there were escalating tensions between the U.S. and China after China approved those Hong Kong security measures against the U.S. wishes, of course. The U.S. saying Hong Kong is no longer autonomous. There's a laundry list of scenarios that could result from that. But geopolitical risk really just doesn't seem to be at the forefront of traders and investors' minds. It really seems to be all about this reopening narrative, the idea that maybe we have bottomed out and we're seeing marginal improvements in the data, like the U.S. Continuing jobless claims we got today. Yes, still a horrific number, 21 million, but that was the first time that those continuing claims had actually fallen since the pandemic started. Where all of that leaves us is we're up about 0.5%, nearly 0.75% for the U.S. major averages. While interestingly, David, it is small caps that are underperforming today after a recent string of outperformance. And we're seeing that reflected in the equity market as well. Of course, this week, the big narrative has been the cyclical value rotation into weaker areas of the market like financials and energy, for example. They are still outperforming on the week. The financials index, for example, is up by about 8%, but they're actually lagging on the day while we're seeing some buying come back in to the technology sector, although not so much into those FANG mega cap tech names. They are still in the red on the week at this point, David.
Well, the interesting thing there, Carrie, for me at least, is, as you say, it's the guys that got beaten up the worst on the way down that now seems to be bouncing back. And there are things like small caps, as you say, but also cruise lines and things like that. Is that really a question of have we hit bottom? Because if we've hit bottom, that means we may be coming back up.
Well, and that's what increasingly you're hearing from strategists on the street, saying that once we have seen potentially a bottom in the data is when we're going to see that rotation into value. So clearly that's what the market is betting on, because we have value stocks on pace for their best week relative to growth since all the way back in 2009. So clearly it is about that reopening narrative. That seems to be what the market is playing at this point, although we are seeing those trades unwind just a touch in today's session, David.
Okay, Kaylee, thank you so very much. That's Kaylee Lyons reporting on the markets. Well, the markets, at least today, may not be reacting to what's going on with China, but there's no question that relations between Beijing and Washington are increasingly strained as they clamp down in China on Hong Kong, and President Trump is none too happy about it. Welcome now, former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to China. He is Max Baucus, who, before he was ambassador, served for some 36 years in the United States Senate from his home state of Montana, including as the chair of the Finance Committee in the Senate. So, Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. Give us a sense of where we are right now, because the rhetoric seems really troubling.
I think it's important to know that Hong Kong is neuralgic to China. I was at a summit between President Obama and President Xi Jinping, and I was struck with that back then, 2014, just how strongly Xi Jinping was upset with potential American interference in Hong Kong. It bothered him more than any other subject during that summit. It's Hong Kong, it's Taiwan, it's Xinjiang, it's Tibet. Those are such strong core issues for China, and they will do whatever it takes to maintain as much control over those areas as they possibly can. Now, I think, frankly, that China feels a little more emboldened now by taking this action, which clearly does violate the basic law in Hong Kong. More emboldened because the United States is withdrawn so much from the world scene. It's withdrawn from TPP. It's withdrawn from under America First. It does not quite have the same power and influence worldwide as it may have had several years ago, and Xi Jinping has seen that. This action, frankly, it just is quite ominous because there's not much the United States can do about it. We can try to rally international opinion. I don't think that's going to have much effect. Add to that, it's going to further drive a wedge between Taiwan and China, because Taiwan is very sympathetic to Hong Kong. And the more Taiwan is sympathetic with Hong Kong, the more that's going to upset China and create even greater tension between China and Taiwan. It's going to hurt business in Taiwan, clearly. It's going to hurt American business, too. But really what this comes down to is the realization that China is here. China's not going anywhere. China's proud. China's defiant. And we Americans have to do a better job figuring out how to deal with this phenomenon, how to deal with this big country, China, how we get their respect, because we have to figure out some way to deal with them. They're not going anywhere. They're not going to leave the planet. We're not going anywhere. We're here. So we have to figure out how to coexist in a much more sound way.
Well, there's a lot of talk going on in Washington, as you know, about things that maybe the United States might do to influence Beijing. You just said that it's so important to Beijing. It's not clear anything's going to work, but they've talked about things like the autonomous status, changing their trade status. They've talked about delisting Chinese companies. In the New York Times today, there was even some speculation maybe we would really interfere with bank relationships. That is to say that U.S. banks couldn't deal with Hong Kong banks. Would any of those have an effect with Beijing?
I don't think so. Beijing's made up its mind. It's going to weather the storm, and it feels it can weather the storm without too much difficulty. It's as we know, under the handover in 1997, Hong Kong is to revert to China in 2047. Xi Jinping has just accelerated that. I mean, it clearly has violated the basic law, the terms of the handover, but basically, all these actions that we are considering are going to hurt China a bit. They'll hurt U.S. a bit. They'll hurt Hong Kong a bit. They'll hurt world trade a bit, but they're not going to force Beijing to change its mind. Beijing's made up its mind. It's going to slowly, gradually take over Hong Kong and merge it in with southern China.
What does that say about investments in in Hong Kong? Because there are enormous Western investments in Hong Kong, a lot of operations for U.S. banks and others there. That really suggests that those investments are a melting asset, frankly.
Well, the question is how quickly they melt. It probably depends upon the actual provisions in this national security law, which has not yet been passed. And it depends on the implementation and the definition of terms. But clearly, the passage of the law by China, as it affects Hong Kong, is going to cause a lot more Beijing control over Hong Kong, and it's going to undermine significantly the rule of law. I think, frankly, Beijing is going to just tighten the noose slowly. Don't want to create too much of a stir, but the writing's on the wall. It's clear that over time, the investments in Hong Kong are going to have to. Investors in Hong Kong have to figure out: do they want to work with China? Do they not want to work with China? Want to leave? Can they deal with China? You know, a lot of American investors are in China, not just Hong Kong, but in China, and do very well. They develop relationships that are not threatening to China. So a lot of decisions are going to have to be made. But bottom line, the atmospherics of this are not good. It pushes us more toward a kind of decoupling. Pushes us more toward a kind of a Cold War. And I just hope that the cooler heads prevail. We don't do things that cause more problems they're going to solve.
Ambassador Baucus, you, of course, are a lifelong Democrat. At this point, do you see any difference at all between the Democrats' position with respect to China and the Republicans? Or is this one place where there's true bipartisan agreement?
There is generally true bipartisan agreement. I think the one difference you'll see is that under a Trump presidency, if he gets reelected, it'll be more of the same. If Biden's elected president, there'll still be a strong bipartisan concern and almost an antagonistic approach toward China. The difference will be that under a Biden presidency, it'll be more stable. That is, President Biden will not change his mind as often as President Trump does. And I think under a Biden presidency, Beijing will think, well, gee, we can deal with this guy. They don't like us. They're tough with us, but a deal is a deal with him. Whereas we try to deal with Trump, we don't know if we have a deal. That'd be the difference.
Okay. It's really a delight to have you with us, Mr. Ambassador. That is former U.S. Ambassador to China. He is Max Baucus. And coming up, we now have a plan out of the European Commission for how to help the European economy. Our very own Stephanie Flanders will be here to take us through that plan, which is a big surprise to many people. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It is time now for First Word News. For that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
Thank you. The White House is refusing to put its stamp on data documenting the plunge into recession during the coronavirus pandemic. Bloomberg has learned the Trump administration won't issue a formal economic forecast showing the extent of the U.S. downturn caused by the pandemic. The forecast is traditionally included in a part of the White House budget procession called the mid-session review, which is usually issued in July or August. The European Union has a growing list of grievances with China. Still, German Chancellor Angela Merkel says the bloc needs to consider the big picture.
The European Union has a great strategic interest to improve the cooperation with China, which is one of the major actors in this century actively. To master our relations, it will also depend not only on the improvement of diplomacy and trade relations, but also on the fact that we, the Europeans, have to recognize the resolve of China in the international architecture.
And the chancellor there, speaking through an interpreter, Merkel says the relationship with China will be a top priority when her government takes over the EU's rotating presidency July 1st. A setback in South Korea. The country reported its biggest spike in new coronavirus cases in nearly 2 months, raising fears of a second wave of infections. Health authorities are focused on a new outbreak at a distribution center for an e-commerce company, which has increased in popularity as many turn to online shopping during the pandemic. The government is closing museums and parks in response to the new infections. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen yesterday unveiled a €750 billion package to support the European economy. And our colleague, Stephanie Flanders, who is the senior executive editor for economics here at Bloomberg, is here to take us through that package. Stephanie, thank you for being with us. In the past, you've said it really isn't all a question of the ECB, but boy, if the Commission can deliver this, this could make a difference, couldn't it?
No, and this is something, I mean, I've even had seasoned commentators on all things European say that this might actually be one reason why the 2020 wasn't only known for COVID-19, which is quite a striking thing to say. But this is really a historic move, potentially, by the European Commission. And as you know, David, it sort of comes after we had the leadership of, the two most important countries in the European Union, France and Germany, President Macron and Chancellor Merkel coming together and proposing a very similar plan last week. So we know that something like this has the support of those key players, which makes you think it is quite likely to happen. But the real importance is this is serious budgetary support, a big chunk of it in grant form. So it's real money. It's not loans with a lot of strings attached, which is designed specifically for the case of this crisis to help the countries that need budgetary support. So this is going to be countries like Italy and Spain that most need help, in effect getting money from the richer economies, which, as you know, throughout the Eurozone crisis, that was the line that the Germans really didn't want to cross.
Well, a terribly important point. It goes to where it's needed, but it takes it away from countries that are doing better. We always think about Germany in that connection, but we also have things like the Netherlands. We have Austrian things. There's a few steps they have to go through before this plan actually becomes real, right?
Yeah, it will need to get the support of everyone. And of course, when it comes to Europe with 227 countries, that's not always going to be easy. But I think what is different this time and why we think that something similar to this will ultimately happen is what I said earlier, is the fact that you have France and Germany on the same side pushing for this. In the past, of course, it's been Germany that's been, if you like, the ringleader of the frugal group of countries that feel like they've managed their affairs very well and they don't want to reward countries who've got themselves into difficult situations like Italy. And that was very much the dynamic in the Eurozone crisis in 2012. There was not a desire to have a lot of burden sharing with those countries. But COVID, in so many ways, is different, and it is Germany is looking at it differently. Not only is it opening the spigots in terms of its own spending that we haven't seen in the past, willingness to borrow a lot of money, but also is understanding that this is not, you can't blame this on Italy not having structural reforms, of being an inflexible economy. All these countries have been faced with a shock which is not of their own making.
Germany is looking at it differently. At the same time, Chancellor Angela Merkel made it clear that it's going to take some negotiation and some time to get this done. Here's part of what Chancellor Merkel had to say.
I believe that with their own proposal, Germany and France have made a good contribution to this one. It is clear that the negotiations now will be very difficult. This will not be concluded at the next EU Council meeting. The aim must be to find enough time in the fall for national parliaments and for the European Parliament to discuss, so that this is ready to come into effect on the 1st of January next year.
So, Stephanie, that sounds like we shouldn't be waiting for this anytime soon. Are we talking about the fall or even toward the end of the year?
Yeah, I mean, of course, nothing is ever instant. And of course, that is why we have often said that this kind of government support, even if when it's coming from national governments, you don't necessarily think that the fiscal support is going to be as effective or as quick as support from central banks. So, of course, what the European Central Bank continues to do is going to be very important for Europe. But I think because this is specific, this is supposed to be a one-off. So, of course, there's a possibility that we'll never see this again, although it's symbolically important. But if it is designed to help countries respond to this pandemic, I think there's a sense in which it has to happen on a reasonably tight schedule. And if it did happen for January 1st of 2021, I think it could still give serious support to countries that will be facing these enormous bills from the pandemic.
And the big question perhaps is, how is it going to be paid for as a practical matter? Because sooner or later they have to pay for this. As I understand, it's going to come out of the budget of the European community generally, but is there enough money in that? Are they going to have to actually tax? Are they going to have a treasury for the European community now?
So they're going to borrow, the European Commission is going to borrow in order to supplement the budget for this. And each country will be liable for the share of that borrowing according to their relative size in the European Union. So, of course, the richer economies will be liable for more of that borrowing. But this is the really important thing that's different. In the past, we've talked about having corona bonds or having some kind of that was the key step that the European Union needed to take, was to have some idea of federalism, of federal debt, where they're all taking on. This isn't quite that, because it's the European Commission and each country is kind of liable for its own part, but it goes a big step towards that. You are starting along that road that the US took quite a long time to get towards being a federal union.
If it happens, what does it mean for the European economy?
Well, as I said, I think it will do some good. So it's not just the symbolism in the history books. It's enough money, 750 billion euros. In the case of Italy, the money that it might reasonably get could be several percentage points of GDP. So it's serious money. But it will matter, of course, how it's spent. And I think that's one thing that will be very important long term. It's supposed to be one-off. But if it looks like it went well, if it looks like it was well spent by Italy, and that maybe Germany's been a bit harsh in thinking that Italy is always going to waste any money it's given, then that could really put it on the road to being this historic milestone. But it will matter how it's spent.
Okay, Stephanie, thank you so very much. That's Bloomberg's Senior Executive Editor for Economics, Stephanie Flanders, who I'm pleased to say is a regular contributor to Wall Street Week as well. And we have two breaking news stories now as we've been talking. First of all, Credit Suisse is saying they're going to review lending to the most wealthy of its clients in the wake of the pandemic. In the meantime, BlackRock is attracting some of the world's largest investors. This is in the wake, of course, of PNC cashing out their stake in BlackRock. It shows that Larry Fink still has the ability to really attract some of the big investors. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Stock of the Hour, and our Stock of the Hour is Twitter, in the middle, as we know, of a battle with President Trump, with President Trump allegedly going to sign an executive order to really expand its possible liability today, and its stock is moving as a result. Kaylee Lyons is here to tell us all about it. Kaylee?
Yeah, David, you're right. Twitter is holding down about 2.5% right now. Of course, this drama all started on Tuesday when Twitter added a fact-check note to 2 of President Trump's tweets about mail-in ballots. This is the first time that they've ever done something like this. Their info page said Trump made unsubstantiated claims about voter fraud. And of course, that inspired a very fast and furious reaction from the president. He tweeted yesterday that he would strongly regulate or even close down social media platforms he says silence conservative voices, and that big action would follow. And today, reportedly, he's poised to sign an executive order, as you mentioned, to kind of rein in social media companies like Twitter. The administration spokesperson said today it's still in the works, but according to a draft seen by Bloomberg, it would have the government narrow liability protections for the company currently enjoys for third-party posts. Basically wants the FCC to issue new rules clarifying how the companies might act in bad faith when taking down or limiting the visibility of posts, and that could potentially allow users to sue the companies if the posts are taken down. I would say, though, David, if you ask analysts today, they don't really think this will have a substantial effect. Our analysts here at Bloomberg Intelligence say even if the president invokes Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, it wouldn't produce a meaningful change in liability exposure for Twitter or the likes of Facebook. Other analysts pointing out that the FCC, FTC commissioners generally have been opposed to social media regulation, so something like this may be more bark than it is bite.
Yeah, and in the meantime, the Twitter may have something of an ally on the Democrat side. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, as you pointed out to me, has come out sort of defending Twitter.
Yeah, it's interesting. You have the likes of Adam Schiff defending Twitter as well, but Pelosi called the situation outrageous, first of all, but then she actually said that Twitter hasn't gone far enough, that it actually is at fault for not taking down entirely some of the president's tweets. And she also pointed a finger at Facebook, saying that they're only in it for profit and that Facebook actually panders to the White House. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and I think for the market today, it kind of reminds us that, oh yeah, big tech regulation is still kind of a bipartisan conversation on Capitol Hill. Obviously, other issues like the virus have been top of mind, but we're still facing antitrust regulation, potentially in issues of privacy. Of course, the election is big for these social media companies as well. And so I think that kind of brings to mind the fact that none of these issues are fully resolved yet for these big tech names, David.
Yeah, it's utterly fascinating. Thank you so very much, Kaylee Lyons, for that report on Twitter, which we will continue to follow. In fact, coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to talk to a law professor from Santa Clara University, Eric Goldman, about exactly what the president can do, what he can't do, what the First Amendment has to say about all of it. And by the way, does Congress get a vote? Because after all, it is a Communications Act that the president is seeking to interpret. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Bloomberg First Word News, and we turn to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Latin America is the new epicenter of the coronavirus. The region represents about 40% of daily deaths globally now. Brazil has more cases than any country except the United States. Some models forecast that deaths, currently at 25,000, could more than quadruple in coming months. Peru, Chile, and Colombia have all set daily records in the past week. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is making what he calls limited and cautious changes to the country's lockdown restrictions. He says schools can begin reopening on Monday, as well as outdoor retail stores. The Prime Minister says people can start to meet outside in groups of up to 6. Meanwhile, the UK's coronavirus tracing program was hit by technical snags on its first day, with some healthcare workers unable to log on to the system. The European Commission is vowing to stay away from fossil-fueled projects in its coronavirus recovery strategy. The EU's executive arm has proposed a $2 trillion package, including a revised long-term budget and a recovery fund, with 25% of the funding set aside for climate action. The money is designed to help coal-dependent countries move away from fossil fuels, but environmental groups are skeptical that the money will be used properly. There was a second night of violent protests in Minneapolis. Demonstrators were angry over the death of a black man in police custody. Police fired tear gas at the crowd, and protesters looted stores near a police station. One man was shot to death. Police say they have a suspect in custody. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, President Trump has been on the warpath with respect to Twitter, really complaining about their decisions to put things up and to take things down. And today, reportedly, he's about to sign an executive order that might actually take that to a legal status, perhaps expanding liability for social media companies. We're now welcome Eric Goldman. He's professor of law at the University of Santa Clara, where he's also co-director of the Tech Law Institute. I wanted to get it right, Professor. So, Professor, thank you for joining us here. I think we have to go to Section 230, right, in the Communications Act, the Decency Act. Explain to us what that does before we talk about modifying it.
Yeah, sure. Section 230 is a law that Congress enacted in the mid-1990s. And to summarize, it says websites aren't liable for third-party content. It means that websites can remove or post content based on their editorial standards and still not be liable for their decisions to publish or remove.
So that's about posting content, but to all appearances, what has upset President Trump is the fact that he posted something alleging that there was fraudulent use of mail-in ballots, and Twitter actually didn't take it down. They included a link to more information on the subject, so they were posting more information. Why is that involved?
Well, that now becomes a much more complicated legal question because, as you point out, it's not directly a Section 230 issue. The circumstance you described, Twitter has fact-checked the president and said there's more facts here that are relevant to readers. So at that point now, Twitter is saying, we think that this statement needs clarification, and we're going to give our readers more resources to understand it better. It's not really a Section 230 issue. That's more of a First Amendment issue. And as a result, a lot of Section 230 angst is misdirected.
Well, so that's fascinating. Can they modify Section 230 to actually create potential liability for Twitter taking something down? Because the allegation, to give President Trump and some of his allies their due, is this is specifically skewed against conservative voices, that there's a bias to the whole thing, and so we're going to make it possible to sue if you say that the reason it was taken down was because of the content of the speech.
Yeah, so Congress created Section 230. Congress could modify or repeal Section 230. But President Trump isn't working with Congress to try and do that. President Trump is trying to unilaterally change Section 230 directly in contravention to what Congress has already said. So President Trump actually really can't do that, and there's not a lot of tools that he has in his unilateral discretion to make any changes on that front. More broadly, even if Section 230 were changed by Trump or Congress, the First Amendment is still going to apply, and there might be First Amendment limits to what any of those two other branches can do that would still protect the decision of something like Twitter fact-checking the president.
So talk about another aspect that at least has been rumored about something they might do, which is to somehow have a declaration or a rulemaking that basically says these social media forums are so big that they're essentially a public space. As I recall, back in the olden days, there was litigation about malls and places like that and whether the First Amendment rules would apply. Could the administration do anything, at least to interpret the question of the scope of the First Amendment in a public space such as social media?
The short answer is no, that any such interpretation comes from the courts, and it can't come from the executive branch. So if the executive branch were to take that position and it were challenged in court, the executive branch would fail. More generally, there are really good reasons why we don't want to think about private publishers as the equivalent of state actors subject to constitutional restrictions. When private publishers decide what content to publish or not publish, they're exercising their editorial discretion, something that's actually protected on its own in the Constitution. It's a really cherished right in our society.
Well, but this is a fascinating point you make, Professor, because traditionally the Facebooks and the Twitters of this world have said, we're not like a traditional publisher. You can't sue us for libel. We're just passing it through sort of like the phone company. Have they positioned themselves to some extent to be a bit more exposed because they're not saying they're like a traditional publisher that's responsible for what's published?
Well, that's correct, but they're saying that because Section 230 says that. Congress made a choice 25 years ago to say we are going to change the normal default paradigms for liability. we're not going to say if you publish you're liable and if you don't publish you're not. We're going to say you can publish and not be liable. And that's been the insight that's unlocked the creation of all these really great new services that didn't exist in the old offline world. So it's not the internet companies that are taking the position that they're like X or Y. They're saying we qualify for Section 230 as Congress anticipated, and we're creating all these great benefits that Congress wanted us to create.
Yeah, one last point here, because President Trump, when he tweeted out today, said this was going to be a great day for fairness when it came to social media. Fairness is something some of us remember back in the old days of the fairness doctrine from the FCC for broadcasters. But is there a problem here because that was done under a licensing scheme where you had to get a license to have a radio or television transmitter? There's no license that I'm aware of for social media.
That's correct. The fairness doctrine basically says that broadcasters have to carry some content that they don't want to carry. It's an incursion on the freedom of speech and press. And that was authorized under the Constitution because of the fact that broadcasting is subject to this licensure scheme. The internet isn't subject to that licensure scheme. They are not subject to the same rules, and therefore you can't impose the same kind of fairness obligations on internet companies that you might have been able to impose on broadcasters. The last thing I'll add on that, and I need to make sure everyone understands this, it was Republican doctrine for 50 years that the fairness doctrine was a deprivation of private property rights. And so to see the head of the Republican Party today saying that we need a fairness doctrine for the internet really shows how far the Republican Party has changed.
Yeah, we've come a long way from Ronald Reagan. Fair point, Professor. Really great to have you with us. That's Professor Eric Goldman of Santa Clara University School of Law on the question of Twitter. Coming up here next, maybe a new way to use artificial intelligence to fight the pandemic. We're going to talk with the CEO of Boy Health. They have an app out that actually the governor of Virginia has endorsed for use down there. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Health systems around the country have been overwhelmed, not just in treating coronavirus patients, but also in diagnosing the condition. We now have a med tech company up in Boston named Boy Health, has a way of perhaps doing a little bit of self-diagnosis, something that the governor of Virginia has specifically commended for the use of people in Virginia. We welcome now the CEO of Boy Health. He is Dr. Andrew Lay. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being with us. First of all, explain exactly what your app does.
Sure, David, and thanks for having me. So even before COVID, what we had built was a program that interviews you like a doctor. It helps you figure out clinically what's most likely going on. And then if we understand what your insurance information is, we can help you get to the right care at the right time in network for you. We've been around since 2013. And then what we saw when coronavirus became a really big issue in China, we said this is definitely going to come to the United States. So we took the CDC guidelines, incorporated them into Buoy, such that we would use the guidelines if you had symptoms for coronavirus to help you understand what to do next. So you wouldn't go to the doctor if you didn't need to. You wouldn't call in if you didn't need to. You'd self-isolate if appropriate. And we launched that in early February. And we actually ended up seeing the spread of the disease as it actually came across the United States. And then we got a lot of interest from large organizations like large insurance companies, multiple states, as you mentioned, Virginia, but it actually first started in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where the government saw an opportunity to say, okay, well, when you're sick, before you call in or before you go in, understand what to do next. And we actually launched with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in early March. We've had well over 100,000 people in the state use Buoy. And over 50% of the time, people didn't need to call a doctor and they could self-isolate or go get testing. And over 90% of the time, they didn't need to go into in-person care. And so if you started to add up all of those visits, we actually saved 1,700 hours of physician's time, or about 71 days worth of physician's time. And during a pandemic, a physician's time is extremely valuable. And so what we saw was we're able to unclog the pipes for the people who did need to call in and for the people who did need to go see a doctor in person. And now we're bringing that to the Commonwealth of Virginia. where we launched last Friday. Extremely excited for that opportunity to, again, do that load balancing, get the right people to the right care at the right time during this essential period, and even thinking about, how we could assist as whole states and whole employers start to reopen and live in this COVID positive world, which is, a big challenge.
So saving healthcare resources, goodness knows, is really precious right now. At the same time, how do you monitor the efficaciousness of what you're doing? That is to say, how do you make sure that you're sending the right people to the doctor and not sending the wrong people to the doctor?
Now that's such an important question, and something that we've wrestled with in our day jobs, even before the pandemic. The way that we're really doing this now is, first, we're adhering to the CDC guidelines on what people should do next. So given that coronavirus is a new disease, and the science behind it is changing on a weekly, if not daily basis, we actually have a clinical team in-house that's dedicated to making sure that we're consistently consistent with those CDC guidelines in helping people understand what to do next. And actually going a step further from that, we actually follow up with patients. So people can opt into receiving text messages from Buoy after they initially use the product. And by following up them and seeing what they ended up doing, how they're doing in quarantine, what the outcome was, we can come in and actually give information back to our internal teams, but even to our partners to say, okay, actually, this is what ends up happening for these sets of people with these symptoms, with these issues. And really providing that feedback loop, to your point, David.
Health is everything, obviously, but also we need to get paid. How do you get paid? Are the states paying you? Is there advertiser support? Where's the revenue coming from?
So, we've never really we've always thought, the ad play really hurts the trust that we're building with the end user here, the patient who's sick, who's scared. The companies that pay us are either large self-insured employers who are looking to reopen and are paying for Buoy for their employees, insurance companies who are paying for Buoy for their members, or for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the Commonwealth of Virginia. Both governments have paid for a version of Buoy that's specific for that particular state that can help the resident understand where to go within the state's set of resources, both from a hospital perspective, from a insurance and telemedicine perspective, as well as from a testing perspective.
Yeah, and finally, briefly, if you could, Dr. Lay, you mentioned large employers who are looking to bring their employees back safely. Talk to us about this other related product, as I understand it, called Back with Care. It's a platform. What does that do?
Sure, David. So as we really responded to COVID very early on, and based on our audit of the space, we actually were the first digital health company to respond to coronavirus in the United States. Because we moved there so early, we really had the brain space to think about, what's going to happen next. And what's going to happen next is facing the challenge of how do you reopen in this COVID positive world before a vaccine is out. And so we've developed a product that really is a further advancement of our coronavirus product that can help an employer help their employees come back safely. So the employee would use Buoy on a daily basis to talk about their symptoms, if they have any, talk about their tests, if they have any, talk about any known exposures, and receive direction from their employer on what to do next, whether that be come in today or, we're actually going to have you stay at home today so that we can keep the right amount of people coming in, socially distanced, masked, etc., to get people back in a way that is as safe as possible during this 12 to 18-month period before a vaccine is out.
Yeah, which is terribly important for the employer. But the other thing, as I understand it, it gives information to the employee. As we all think about going back, how do we know what the situation is in that workplace or in the area where that workplace is? As I understand it, that provides some of that to me as an employee as well.
Exactly. We're taking into account the local level of disease in that particular area. We're taking into account what's happening with that office. We're even taking into account what, at the employee level, what's going on with your fellow employees.
So
It's really
it's
fancy.
a
Really
really
fabulous.
nuanced approach.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lay. Thank you so much, Dr. Lay. That's from Boy Health, Dr. Lay. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The chairman and CEO of Citigroup, Michael Corbett, spoke with our colleague Eric Schatzker earlier today. And one of the things they talked about were the long-term consequences, perhaps, of relying so much on the Federal Reserve for support for the economy.
We don't want to see consumers, small business, big business come out of this in a indebtedness position that's just unsustainable. And that's why I think you've seen in a number of these programs that they've been structured in a way that they're actually grants or have aspects of forgiveness in them, provided the monies are used appropriately. And so the government's thinking about the same thing. We don't want to end up with an economy where our consumers and our business are just saddled with untenable levels of debt. We've got to be mindful that while going into this, the U.S. from a position of strength in terms of the economy growth rates, employment, from a monetary and a fiscal perspective, not without some challenges, right? When you think of the toolbox out there, not just in the U.S., but around the world, low rates, negative rates in some places. And so not a lot of things on the monetary front that can necessarily be used with high impact today, which leads us to fiscal. And the fiscal programs being put in place in terms of small business lending and payroll protection and Main Street lending programs that are out there. And that clearly will take up the levels, or as some people would say, balloon the Fed's balance sheet, and by the way, other balance sheets. And we've got to be mindful that we do not want our government, the U.S. or other governments, to come out in a position where the debt at the government level, the federal level, is untenable, because again, we're likely to be in this slower growth environment for an extended period of time, and we've got to make sure that we've created that balance in terms of people continuing to have confidence in terms of not just the U.S. government, but governments around the world.
So in your mind, how does the government exit, as it were? There are some people who say government doesn't need to, right? Monetize the debt, embrace modern monetary theory. And then there are others who say, as soon as is practical, we're going to have to raise corporate taxes. We may have to raise tax rate on individuals, certainly wealthy individuals. We're going to have to start to chip away at the mountain of debt that we've created as a result of doing the right things to fight this crisis.
Well, again, I think that as you look at this, that we've been in this extended period of fairly lax or easy monetary policy, not just in the U.S. and around the world. And if you go back and look at the Fed balance sheet coming out of the last financial crisis, they were on a path, on a trajectory of getting that back down to, I think, levels that people were becoming much more comfortable with. Obviously, with this, we've had to go back in the other direction. And as we try to get to the other side of this and hopefully come out in the not too distant future, it's going to be back on the table. But as you cite, a couple of things that are out there is that one is the U.S. does continue to be the world's preeminent reserve currency. And, when you look at our treasury auctions and others, it has a very strong international borrowing base and therefore has capacity. I think the second piece of it, and I don't want to be lulled into a false sense of complacency, but the low interest rates impose a very low cost in terms of the U.S. government borrowing to be able to fund these programs that are out there. So again, I think we've got to be prudent. We've got to be mindful in terms of the absolute and relative levels of our indebtedness. And we do have to have a trajectory to get it back to a more sustainable level over time. But I still think we're in a reasonable place right now. And it goes back to how long this goes on for. And again, what needs will be in the future and what kind of commitments it will take from not just the U.S., but other governments around the world to be able to support their economies. We don't know exactly what the path will be like. And so we've got to be very, very mindful of that. I think the U.S. system, like Citi, comes into this from a position of strength. And as part of that, in the first quarter, you saw us build again, as a company and as an industry, considerable reserves. We built almost $5 billion of additional reserves. We've got about $23 billion of reserves right now set aside. And again, we'll continue to watch as we go forward. And as you can imagine, the calculations and the modeling that we do remains very sensitive to unemployment. It remains very sensitive to GDP, to housing prices. And so as we continue to look at what we think the future trajectories are of those, we'll continue to make appropriate decisions around reserving into the future. So again, a position of strength, I think trying to be prudent, smart about it, making sure we're there and the important things to support our clients, but being mindful in terms of capital and capital trajectory into the future.
That was Chairman and CEO of Citigroup, Michael Corbett, speaking earlier today to Bloomberg Television. And later on today, I'm going to get to talk with the governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, about the status of the coronavirus in his state, how they're coming back, and by the way, will commuters still come from New Jersey every day into New York? That's coming up later on Bloomberg Television. For now, that does it for Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.